11. A few weeks after the fall semester of 1932 began, it was clear to William Stoner that he had been unsuccessful in his battle to keep Charles Walker out of the graduate English program. After the summer holidays, Walker returned to the campus, as if triumphantly entering an arena, and when he saw Stoner in the corridors of Jesse Hall, he inclined his head in an ironic bow and grinned at him maliciously. Stoner learned from Jim Holland that Dean Rutherford had delayed making the vote of last year official, and that finally it had been decided that Walker would be allowed to take his oral preliminaries again, his examiners to be selected by the chairman of the department. The battle was over then, and Stoner was willing to concede his defeat, but the fighting did not end. When Stoner met Lomax in the corridors or at a department meeting, or at a college function, he spoke to him as he had spoken before, as if nothing had happened between them, but Lomax would not respond to his greeting. He stared coldly and turned his eyes away, as if to say that he would not be appeased. One day in late fall, Stoner walked casually into Lomax's office and stood beside his desk for several minutes until, reluctantly, Lomax looked up at him, his lips tight and his eyes hard. When he realized that Lomax was not going to speak, Stoner said awkwardly, "Look, Holly, it's over and done with. Can't we just drop it?" Lomax looked at him steadily. Stoner continued, "We've had a disagreement, but that isn't unusual. We've been friends before, and I see no reason—" "We have never been friends," Lomax said distinctly. "All right," Stoner said, "but we've got along at least. We can keep whatever differences we have, but for God's sake, there's no need to display them. Even the students are beginning to notice." "And well, the students might," Lomax said bitterly, "since one of their own number nearly had his career ruined, a brilliant student whose only crimes were his imagination, an enthusiasm and integrity that forced him into conflict with you, and, yes, I might as well say it, an unfortunate physical affliction that would have called forth sympathy in a normal human being." With his good right hand, Lomax held a pencil, and it trembled before him. Almost with horror, Stoner realized that Lomax was dreadfully and irrevocably sincere. "No," Lomax went on passionately, "for that I cannot forgive you." Stoner tried to keep his voice from becoming stiff. "It isn't a question of forgiving. It's simply a question of our behaving toward each other so that not too much discomfort is made for the students and the other members of the department." "I'm going to be very frank with you, Stoner," Lomax said. His anger had quieted, and his voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "I don't think you're fit to be a teacher. No man is, whose prejudices override his talents and his learning. I should probably fire you if I had the power, but I don't have the power, as we both know. You are protected by the tenure system. I must accept that, but I don't have to play the hypocrite. I want to have nothing to do with you, nothing at all, and I will not pretend otherwise." Stoner looked at him steadily for several moments. Then he shook his head. "All right, Holly," he said tiredly. He started to go. "Just a minute," Lomax called. Stoner turned. Lomax was gazing intently at some papers on his desk. His face was red, and he seemed to be struggling with himself. Stoner realized that what he saw was not anger, but shame. Lomax said, "Hereafter, if you want to see me, on department business, you will make an appointment with the secretary." And although Stoner stood looking at him for several moments more, Lomax did not raise his head. A brief writhing went across his face, then it was still. Stoner went out of the room. And for more than 20 years, neither man was to speak again directly to the other. It was, Stoner realized later, inevitable that the students be affected. Even if he had been successful in persuading Lomax to put on an appearance, he could not, in the long run, have protected them from a consciousness of the battle. Former students of his, even students he had known rather well, began nodding and speaking to him self-consciously, even furtively. A few were ostentatiously friendly, going out of their way to speak to him, or to be seen walking with him in the halls, but he no longer had the rapport with them that he once had had. He was a special figure, and one was seen with him, or not seen with him, for special reasons. He came to feel that his presence was an embarrassment both to his friends and his enemies, and so he kept more and more to himself. A kind of lethargy descended upon him. He taught his classes as well as he could, though the steady routine of required freshman and sophomore classes drained him of enthusiasm and left him, at the end of the day, exhausted and numb. As well as he could, he filled the hours between his widely separated classes with student conferences, painstakingly going over the students' work, keeping them until they became restless and impatient. Time dragged slowly around him. He tried to spend more of that time at home with his wife and child, but because of his odd schedule, the hours he could spend there were unusual and not accounted for by Edith's tight disposition of each day. He discovered, not to his surprise, that his regular presence was so upsetting to his wife that she became nervous and silent, and sometimes physically ill. And he was able to see Grace infrequently in all the time he spent at home. Edith had scheduled her daughter's days carefully. Her only free time was in the evening, and Stoner was scheduled to teach a late class 4 evenings a week. By the time the class was over, Grace was usually in bed. So he continued to see Grace only briefly in the mornings, at breakfast, and he was alone with her for only the few minutes it took Edith to clear the breakfast dishes from the table and put them to soak in the kitchen sink. He watched her body lengthen, an awkward grace come into her limbs, and an intelligence grow in her quiet eyes and watchful face. And at times he felt that some closeness remained between them, a closeness which neither of them could afford to admit. At last he went back to his old habit of spending most of his time at his office in Jesse Hall. He told himself that he should be grateful for the chance of reading on his own, free from the pressures of preparing for particular classes, free from the predetermined directions of his learning. He tried to read at random, for his own pleasure and indulgence, many of the things that he had been waiting for years to read. But his mind would not be led where he wished it to go. His attention wandered from the pages he held before him, and more often he found himself staring dully in front of him, at nothing. It was as if from moment to moment his mind were emptied of all it knew, and as if his will were drained of its strength. He felt at times that he was a kind of vegetable, and he longed for something, even pain, to pierce him, to bring him alive. He had come to that moment in his age when there occurred to him, with increasing intensity, a question of such overwhelming simplicity that he had no means to face it. He found himself wondering if his life were worth the living, if it had ever been. It was a question he suspected that came to all men at one time or another. He wondered if it came to them with such impersonal force as it came to him. The question brought with it a sadness, but it was a general sadness, which, he thought, had little to do with himself or with his particular fate. He was not even sure that the question sprang from the most immediate and obvious causes, from what his own life had become. It came, he believed, from the accretion of his years, from the density of accident and circumstance, and from what he had come to understand of them. He took a grim and ironic pleasure from the possibility that what little learning he had managed to acquire had led him to this knowledge, that in the long run all things, even the learning that let him know this, were futile and empty, and at last diminished into a nothingness they did not alter. Once, late after his evening class, he returned to his office and sat at his desk trying to read. It was winter, and the snow had fallen during the day, so that the out-of-doors was covered with a white softness. The office was overheated. He opened a window beside the desk so that the cool air might come into the close room. He breathed deeply and let his eyes wander over the white floor of the campus. On an impulse, he switched out the light on his desk and sat in the hot darkness of his office. The cold air filled his lungs, and he leaned toward the open window. He heard the silence of the winter night, and it seemed to him that he somehow felt the sounds that were absorbed by the delicate and intricately cellular being of the snow. Nothing moved upon the whiteness. It was a dead scene, which seemed to pull at him, to suck at his consciousness, just as it pulled the sound from the air and buried it within a cold white softness. He felt himself pulled outward toward the whiteness, which spread as far as he could see, and which was a part of the darkness from which it glowed, of the clear and cloudless sky without height or depth. For an instant he felt himself go out of the body that sat motionless before the window, and as he felt himself slip away, everything, the flat whiteness, the trees, the tall columns, the night, the far stars, seemed incredibly tiny and far away, as if they were dwindling to a nothingness. Then behind him a radiator clanked. He moved, and the scene became itself. With a curiously reluctant relief, he again snapped on his desk lamp. He gathered a book and a few papers, went out of the office, walked through the darkened corridors, and let himself out of the wide double doors at the back of Jessie Hall. He walked slowly home, aware of each footstep crunching with muffled loudness in the dry snow. 12. During that year, and especially in the winter months, he found himself returning more and more frequently to such a state of unreality. At will, he seemed able to remove his consciousness from the body that contained it, and he observed himself as if he were an oddly familiar stranger doing the oddly familiar things that he had to do. It was a disassociation that he had never felt before. He knew that he ought to be troubled by it, but he was numb, and he could not convince himself that it mattered. He was 42 years old, and he could see nothing before him that he wished to enjoy, and little behind him that he cared to remember. In its 43rd year, William Stoner's body was nearly as lean as it had been when he was a youth, when he had first walked in dazed awe upon the campus that had never wholly lost its effect upon him. Year by year, the stoop of his shoulders had increased, and he had learned to slow his movements, so that his farmer's clumsiness of hand and foot seemed a deliberation rather than an awkwardness bred in the bone. His long face had softened with time, and although the flesh was still like tanned leather, it no longer stretched so tautly over the sharp cheekbones. It was loosened by thin lines around his eyes and mouth. Still sharp and clear, his grey eyes were sunk more deeply in his face, the shrewd watchfulness there half hidden. His hair, once light brown, had darkened, although a few touches of grey were beginning around his temples. He did not think often of the years, or regret their passing, but when he saw his face in a mirror, or when he approached his reflection in one of the glass doors that led into Jessie Hall, he recognized the changes that had come over him with a mild shock. Late one afternoon in the early spring, he sat alone in his office. A pile of freshman themes lay on his desk. He held one of the papers in his hand, but he was not looking at it. As he had been doing frequently of late, he gazed out the window upon that part of the campus he could see from his office. The day was bright, and the shadow cast by Jessie Hall had crept, while he watched, nearly up to the base of the 5 columns that stood in powerful, isolate grace in the center of the rectangular quad. The portion of the quad in shadow was a deep brownish grey. Beyond the edge of the shadow, the winter grass was a light tan, overlaid with a shimmering film of the palest green. Against the spidery black tracings of vine stems that curled around them, the marble columns were brilliantly white. Soon the shadow would creep upon them, Stoner thought, and the bases would darken, and the darkness would creep up, slowly, and then more rapidly, until he became aware that someone was standing behind him. He turned in his chair and looked up. It was Katherine Driscoll, the young instructor who last year had sat in on his seminar. Since that time, though they sometimes met in the corridors and nodded, they had not really spoken to each other. Stoner was aware that he was dimly annoyed by this confrontation. He did not wish to be reminded of the seminar and of what had ensued from it. He pushed his chair back and got awkwardly to his feet. "Miss Driscoll," he said soberly, and motioned to the chair beside his desk. She gazed at him for a moment. Her eyes were large and dark, and he thought that her face was extraordinarily pale. With a slight ducking motion of the head, she moved away from him and took the chair, to which he vaguely motioned. Stoner seated himself again and stared at her for a moment without really seeing her. Then, aware that his regard of her might be taken as rudeness, he tried to smile, and he murmured an inane, automatic question about her classes. She spoke abruptly. You said once that you would be willing to look over my dissertation whenever I had a good start on it." "Yes," Stoner said and nodded. "I believe I did. Of course." Then for the first time he noticed that she clutched a folder of papers in her lap. "Of course, if you're busy," she said tentatively. Not at all, Stoner said, trying to put some enthusiasm in his voice. I'm sorry, I didn't intend to sound distracted. She hesitantly lifted the folder toward him. He took it, hefted it, and smiled at her. I thought you would be further along than this, he said. I was, she said, but I started over. I'm taking a new tack, and I'll be grateful if you'll tell me what you think. He smiled at her again and nodded. He did not know what to say. They sat in awkward silence for a moment. Finally, he said, When do you need this back? She shook her head. Anytime. Whenever you can get around to it. I don't want to hold you up, he said. How about this coming Friday? That should give me plenty of time. About 3 o'clock? She rose as abruptly as she had sat down. Thank you, she said. I don't want to be a bother. Thank you. And she turned and walked, slim and erect, out of his office. He held the folder in his hands for a few moments, staring at it. Then he put it on his desk and got back to his freshman themes. That was on a Tuesday, and for the next 2 days the manuscript lay untouched on his desk. For reasons that he did not fully understand, he could not bring himself to open the folder, to begin the reading which a few months before would have been a duty of pleasure. He watched it warily, as if it were an enemy that was trying to entice him again into a war that he had renounced. And then it was Friday, and he still had not read it. He saw it lying accusingly on his desk in the morning, when he gathered his books and papers for his 8 o'clock class. When he returned, at a little after 9, he nearly decided to leave a note in Miss Driscoll's mailbox in the main office, begging off for another week. But he resolved to look at it hurriedly before his 11 o'clock class and say a few perfunctory words to her when she came by that afternoon. But he could not make himself get to it, and just before he had to leave for the class, his last of the day, he grabbed the folder from his desk, stuck it among his other papers, and hurried across campus to his classroom. After the class was over at noon, he was delayed by several students who needed to talk to him, so that it was after 1 o'clock when he was able to break away. He headed, with a kind of grim determination, toward the library. He intended to find an empty carrel and give the manuscript a hasty hour's reading before his 3 o'clock appointment with Miss Driscoll. But even in the dim, familiar quiet of the library, in an empty carrel that he found hidden in the lower depths of the stacks, he had a hard time making himself look at the pages he carried with him. He opened other books and read paragraphs at random. He sat still, inhaling the musty odor that came from the old books. Finally he sighed, unable to put it off longer. He opened the folder and glanced hastily at the first pages. At first, only a nervous edge of his mind touched what he read, but gradually the words forced themselves upon him. He frowned and read more carefully, and then he was caught. He turned back to where he had begun, and his attention flowed upon the page. Yes, he said to himself, of course. Much of the material that she had given in her seminar report was contained here, but rearranged, reorganized, pointing in directions that he himself had only dimly glimpsed. My God, he said to himself in a kind of wonder, and his fingers trembled with excitement as he turned the pages. When he came to the last sheet of typescript, he leaned back in happy exhaustion and stared at the grey cement wall before him. Although it seemed only a few minutes had elapsed since he started reading, he glanced at his watch. It was nearly 4:30. He scrambled to his feet, gathered the manuscript hastily, and hurried out of the library. And though he knew it was too late for it to make any difference, he half ran across the campus to Jessie Hall. As he passed the open door of the main office on his way to his own, he heard his name called. He halted and stuck his head in the doorway. The secretary, a new girl that Lomax had recently hired, said to him accusingly, almost insolently, Miss Driscoll was here to see you at 3 o'clock. She waited nearly an hour. He nodded, thanked her, and proceeded more slowly to his office. He told himself that it didn't matter, that he could return the manuscript to her on Monday and make his apologies then, but the excitement he had felt when he finished the manuscript would not subside, and he paced restlessly round his office. Every now and then he paused and nodded to himself. Finally, he went to his bookcase, searched for a moment, and withdrew a slender pamphlet with smeared black lettering on the cover. Faculty and Staff Directory, University of Missouri. He found Katherine Driscoll's name. She did not have a telephone. He noted her address, gathered her manuscript from his desk, and went out of his office. About 3 blocks from the campus, toward town, a cluster of large old houses had, some years before, been converted into apartments. These were filled by older students, younger faculty, staff members of the university, and a scattering of townspeople. The house in which Katherine Driscoll lived stood in the midst of these. It was a huge 3-storied building of grey stone, with a bewildering variety of entrances and exits, with turrets and bay windows and balconies projecting outward and upward on all sides. Stoner finally found Katherine Driscoll's name on a mailbox at the side of the building, where a short flight of cement steps led down to a basement door. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked. When Katherine Driscoll opened the door for him, William Stoner almost did not recognize her. She had swept her hair up and caught it carelessly high in the back, so that her small, pink-white ears were bare. She wore dark-rimmed glasses, behind which her dark eyes were wide and startled. She had on a mannish shirt, open at the neck, and she was wearing dark slacks that made her appear slimmer and more graceful than he remembered her. I'm sorry I missed our appointment," Stoner said awkwardly. He thrust the folder toward her. "I thought you might need this over the weekend." For several moments she did not speak. She looked at him expressionlessly and bit her lower lip. She moved back from the door. "Won't you come in?" He followed her through a very short, narrow hall into a tiny room, low-ceilinged and dim, with a low 3-quarter bed that served as a couch, a long, low table before it, a single upholstered chair, a small desk and chair, and a bookcase filled with books on one wall. Several books were lying open on the floor and on the couch, and papers were scattered on the desk. "It's very small," Katherine Driscoll said, stooping to pick up one of the books on the floor. "But I don't need much room." He sat in the upholstered chair across the couch. She asked him if he would like some coffee, and he said he would. She went into the little kitchen off the living room, and he relaxed and gazed around him, listening to the quiet sounds of her moving around in the kitchen. She brought the coffee in delicate white china cups on a black lacquered tray, which she set on the table before the couch. They sipped the coffee and talked strainedly for a few moments. Then Stoner spoke of the part of the manuscript he had read, and the excitement he had felt earlier in the library came over him. He leaned forward, speaking intensely. For many minutes the two of them were able to talk together unself-consciously, hiding themselves under the cover of their discourse. Katherine Driscoll sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes flashing, her slender fingers clasping and unclasping above the coffee table. William Stoner hitched his chair forward and leaned intently toward her. They were so close that he could have extended his hand and touched her. They spoke of the problems raised by the early chapters of her work, of where the inquiry might lead, of the importance of the subject. "You mustn't give it up," he said, and his voice took on an urgency that he could not understand. "No matter how hard it will seem sometimes, you mustn't give it up. It's too good for you to give it up." "Oh, it's good, there's no doubt of it." She was silent, and for a moment the animation left her face. She leaned back, looked away from him, and said, as if absently, "The seminar, some of the things you said, it was very helpful." He smiled and shook his head. "You didn't need the seminar, but I am glad you were able to sit in on it. It was a good one, I think." "Oh, it's shameful," she burst out. "It's shameful. The seminar, I had to start it over after the seminar. It's shameful that they should..." She paused in bitter, furious confusion, got up from the couch, and walked restlessly to the desk. Stoner, taken aback by the outburst, for a moment did not speak. Then he said, "You shouldn't concern yourself. These things happen. It will all work out in time. It really isn't important." And suddenly, after he said the words, it was not important. For an instant he felt the truth of what he said, and for the first time in months he felt lift away from him the weight of a despair whose heaviness he had not fully realized. Nearly giddy, almost laughing, he said again, "It really isn't important." But an awkwardness had come between them, and they could not speak as freely as they had a few moments before. Soon Stoner got up, thanked her for the coffee, and took his leave. She walked with him to the door and seemed almost curt when she told him good night. It was dark outside, and a spring chill was in the evening air. He breathed deeply and felt his body tingle in the coolness. Beyond the jagged outline of the apartment houses, the town lights glowed upon a thin mist that hung in the air. At the corner, a street light pushed feebly against the darkness that closed around it. From the darkness beyond it, the sound of laughter broke abruptly into the silence, lingered, and died. The smell of smoke from trash burning in backyards was held by the mist, and as he walked slowly through the evening, breathing the fragrance and tasting upon his tongue the sharp nighttime air, it seemed to him that the moment he walked in was enough, and that he might not need a great deal more. And so he had his love affair. The knowledge of his feeling for Katherine Driscoll came upon him slowly. He found himself discovering pretexts for going to her apartment in the afternoons. The title of a book or article would occur to him. He would note it and deliberately avoid seeing her in the corridors of Jessie Hall, so that he might drop by her place in the afternoon to give her the title, have a cup of coffee, and talk. Once he spent half a day in the library pursuing a reference that might reinforce a point that he thought dubious in her second chapter. Another time he laboriously transcribed a portion of a little-known Latin manuscript of which the library owned a photostat, and was thus able to spend several afternoons helping her with the translation. During the afternoons they spent together, Katherine Driscoll was courteous, friendly, and reserved. She was quietly grateful for the time and interest he expended upon her work, and she hoped she was not keeping him from more important things. It did not occur to him that she might think of him other than as an interested professor whom she admired, and whose aid, though friendly, was little beyond the call of his duty. He thought of himself as a faintly ludicrous figure, one in whom no one could take an interest other than impersonal. And after he admitted to himself his feeling for Katherine Driscoll, he was desperately careful that he not show this feeling in any way that could be easily discerned. For more than a month he dropped by her apartment 2 or 3 times a week, staying no more than 2 hours at any one time. He was fearful that she would become annoyed at his continued reappearances, so he was careful to come only when he was sure that he could be genuinely helpful to her work. With a kind of grim amusement, he realized that he was preparing for his visits to her with the same diligence that he prepared for lectures, and he told himself that this would be enough, that he would be contented only to see her and talk to her for as long as she might endure his presence. But despite his care and effort, the afternoons they spent together became more and more strained. For long moments they found themselves in nothing to say. They sipped their coffee and looked away from each other. They said, "Well," in tentative and guarded voices, and they found reasons for moving restlessly around the room, away from each other. With a sadness, the intensity of which he had not expected, Stoner told himself that his visits were becoming a burden to her, and that her courtesy forbade her to let him be aware of that. As he had known he would have to do, he came to his decision. he would withdraw from her, gradually, so that she would not realize he had noticed her restlessness, as if he had given her all the help that he could. He dropped by her apartment only once the next week, and the following week he did not visit her at all. He had not anticipated the struggle that he would have with himself. In the afternoons, as he sat in his office, he had almost physically to restrain himself from rising from his desk, hurrying outside and walking to her apartment. Once or twice he saw her at a distance, in the halls, as she was hurrying to or from class. He turned away and walked in another direction, so that they would not have to meet. After a while, a kind of numbness came upon him, and he told himself that it would be all right, that in a few days he would be able to see her in the halls, nod to her and smile, perhaps even detain her for a moment and ask her how her work was going. Then, one afternoon in the main office, as he was removing some mail from his box, he overheard a young instructor mention to another that Katherine Driscoll was ill, that she hadn't met her classes for the past 2 days. And the numbness left him. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, and his resolve and the strength of his will went out of him. He walked jerkily to his own office and looked with a kind of desperation at his bookcase, selected a book, and went out. By the time he got to Katherine Driscoll's apartment, he was out of breath, so that he had to wait several moments in front of her door. He put a smile on his face that he hoped was casual, fixed it there, and knocked at her door. She was even paler than usual, and there were dark smudges around her eyes. She wore a plain dark blue dressing gown, and her hair was drawn back severely from her face. Stoner was aware that he spoke nervously and foolishly, yet he was unable to stop the flow of his words. "Hello," he said brightly. "I heard you were ill. I thought I would drop over to see how you are. I have a book that might be helpful to you. Are you all right? I don't want to—" He listened to the sounds tumble from his stiff smile and could not keep his eyes from searching her face. When at last he was silent, she moved back from the door and said quietly, "Come in." Once inside the little sitting bedroom, his nervous inanity dropped away. He sat in the chair opposite the bed and felt the beginnings of a familiar ease come over him when Katherine Driscoll sat across from him. For several moments neither of them spoke. Finally she asked, "Do you want some coffee?" "You mustn't bother," Stoner said. "It's no bother." Her voice was brusque and had that undertone of anger that he had heard before. "I'll just heat it up." She went into the kitchen. Stoner, alone in the little room, stared glumly at the coffee table and told himself that he should not have come. He wondered at the foolishness that drove men to do the things they did. Katherine Driscoll came back with the coffee pot and 2 cups. She poured their coffee, and they sat watching the steam rise from the black liquid. She took a cigarette from a crumpled package, lit it, and puffed nervously for a moment. Stoner became aware of the book he had carried with him, and that he still clutched in his hands. He put it on the coffee table between them. "Perhaps you aren't feeling up to it," he said, "but I ran across something that might be helpful to you, and I thought—" "I haven't seen you in nearly 2 weeks," she said, and stubbed her cigarette out, twisting it fiercely in the ashtray. He was taken aback. He said distractedly, "I've been rather busy. So many things." "It doesn't matter," she said. "Really, it doesn't. I shouldn't have." She rubbed the palm of her hand across her forehead. He looked at her with concern. He thought she must be feverish. "I'm sorry, Iril. If there's anything I can—" "I'm not ill," she said, and she added in a voice that was calm, speculative, and almost uninterested, "I am desperately, desperately unhappy." And still he did not understand. The bare, sharp utterance went into him like a blade. He turned a little away from her. He said confusedly, "I'm sorry. Could you tell me about it? If there's anything I can do." She lifted her head. Her features were stiff, but her eyes were brilliant in pools of tears. I didn't intend to embarrass you. I'm sorry. You must think me very foolish. No, he said. He looked at her for a moment more, at the pale face that seemed held expressionless by an effort of will. Then he gazed at his large, bony hands that were clasped together on one knee. The fingers were blunt and heavy, and the knuckles were like white knobs upon the brown flesh. He said at last, heavily and slowly, "In many ways I am an ignorant man. It is I who am foolish, not you. I have not come to see you because I felt that I was becoming a nuisance. Maybe that was not true." "No," she said. "No, it wasn't true." Still not looking at her, he continued, "And I didn't want to cause you the discomfort of having to deal with my feelings for you, which I knew sooner or later would become obvious if I kept seeing you." She did not move. 2 tears welled over her lashes and ran down her cheeks. She did not brush them away. "I was perhaps selfish. I felt that nothing could come of this except awkwardness for you and unhappiness for me. You know my circumstances. It seemed to me impossible that you could feel for me anything but—" "Shut up," she said, softly, fiercely. "Oh, my dear, shut up and come over here." He found himself trembling. As awkwardly as a boy, he went around the coffee table and sat beside her. Tentatively, clumsily, their hands went out to each other. They clasped each other in an awkward, strained embrace, and for a long time they sat together without moving, as if any movement might let escape from them the strange and terrible thing that they held between them in a single grasp. Her eyes, that he had thought to be a dark brown or black, were a deep violet. Sometimes they caught the dim light of a lamp in the room and glittered moistly. He could turn his head one way and another, and the eyes beneath his gaze would change color as he moved, so that it seemed, even in repose, they were never still. Her flesh, that had at a distance seemed so cool and pale, had beneath it a warm, ruddy undertone, like light flowing beneath a milky translucence. And like the translucent flesh, the calm and poise and reserve, which he had thought were herself, masked a warmth and playfulness and humor whose intensity was made possible by the appearance that disguised them. In his 43rd year, William Stoner learned what others, much younger, had learned before him, that the person one loves at first is not the person one loves at last, and that love is not an end, but a process through which one person attempts to know another. They were both very shy, and they knew each other slowly, tentatively. They came close and drew apart. They touched and withdrew, neither wishing to impose upon the other more than might be welcomed. Day by day, the layers of reserve that protected them dropped away, so that at last they were like many who are extraordinarily shy, each open to the other, unprotected, perfectly and unself-consciously at ease. Nearly every afternoon, when his classes were over, he came to her apartment. They made love and talked and made love again, like children who did not think of tiring at their play. The spring days lengthened, and they looked forward to the summer.